The headlights flickered across the empty, rain-slicked road, and in the pitch-black night, there was only silence, except for the soft rumble of the old car's engine. Claire's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they should have. Her breath fogged the windshield faintly as she glanced in the rearview mirror, eyes scanning the shadows beyond. She was certain she had seen the same pair of headlights trailing her for miles. They were far behind, dim and distant, but every time she turned, they turned too. Was it her imagination? No, she wasn't being paranoid. Suddenly, the lights disappeared. Her heart stopped for a beat, only to stutter painfully back to life when she heard the sound of a vehicle accelerating rapidly behind her. Claire's pulse quickened, sweat slicking her palms. She tightened her grip. She had nowhere to run. The rain fell harder now, battering the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. And then the lights swerved into the opposite lane. Claire gasped as a dark SUV overtook her old sedan in a blur of speed and water. For a moment, she thought it was over, her fears unfounded, just another stranger speeding through the storm. But as the SUV suddenly slowed, forcing her to brake, her stomach dropped. They weren't done with her. 3 months earlier, Claire had never imagined her life would spiral like this. She had come to Ravenwood, a small town tucked away in the misty hills, to escape, to breathe. Fresh from the ruins of an engagement, she had decided to trade the chaos of the city for the slow serenity of a place no one knew her name. A fresh start. A quaint cottage on the edge of the woods and a bookstore job were supposed to be the ingredients for a peaceful, if unremarkable life. But then she met him. Ronan. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the clouds pressed low and the wind howled through the alleyways. The bell above the bookstore door tinkled as a gust of cold air swept in, and there he stood, tall, brooding, dripping rain onto the hardwood floor. His dark hair clung to his sharp cheekbones, and his piercing gaze landed on her like a needle to skin. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice deep, gravely, as though he didn't use it much. He gave a crooked, disarming smile. "I didn't mean to bring the storm inside." Claire blinked, momentarily stunned by the sudden intensity he brought into the quiet little shop. He was the kind of man you noticed, whether you wanted to or not, a man carved from shadows and secrets. "It's fine," she managed. He bought a book that day, Wuthering Heights. When he handed her the cash, their fingers brushed, and for the briefest second, Claire swore the world slowed. Ronan returned every day after that, like clockwork. Sometimes he would buy a book, sometimes he would just browse, his presence dark but never unkind. There was a loneliness about him that Claire understood all too well. He never spoke much, but when he did, his voice was like a balm, something that lingered in her chest long after he left. "Why this one?" she had asked him once, holding up Wuthering Heights. She couldn't stop herself from wanting to know him better. "It's honest," he had replied simply, his gaze heavy on hers. Even the dark parts. Their friendship grew in small, unspoken moments. The way he looked for her when he entered the shop, the way he seemed to know when she was sad. Eventually, Claire began to crave his company, even if it came cloaked in silence. There was something about him, an edge she couldn't define, a mystery she couldn't resist. But everyone in Ravenwood whispered about Ronan. "They say he's dangerous." Claire's coworker Naomi warned one evening after Ronan had left. His family was involved in things. "What kind of things?" Claire pressed. Naomi shrugged. "Trouble follows men like him." Claire should have listened. She should have kept her distance. But how could she, when Ronan made her feel alive again? One evening, they stood together outside the bookstore, the sun sinking low behind the misty trees. He had walked her to her car, as he sometimes did, though Claire never asked him to. "Why do you always look after me, Ronan?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened as though he didn't want to answer. Then he looked at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Because you matter to me." It was the way he said it, like a confession, like a warning. Claire knew then that she was already in too deep. She started seeing them, the black SUVs. The first time, she thought it was coincidence. The second, she convinced herself she was imagining things. But by the third, Claire couldn't ignore the truth. She was being watched, followed. One night, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stay away from him." Her heart stopped. She showed Ronan the message the next day. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked afraid. "Claire." Listen to me, he said, his voice a low whisper. Whatever you do, don't answer that number. Don't trust anyone. What's going on, Ronan? She demanded. Who's following me? Why? But Ronan only shook his head. I never meant to drag you into this. Into what? She cried, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pressed something cold and metallic into her palm, a small, rusted key. If something happens to me, he said, his eyes meeting hers, use this. Go to the old chapel in the woods. Her chest tightened. Ronan, what are you? But he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Now the SUV had stopped her car on the narrow, empty road. Claire sat frozen, like heart pounding against her ribs as the rain streaked down the windows. A figure stepped out of the SUV, shadowed but unmistakable in its slow, deliberate movements. A knock came at her window. Claire hesitated before slowly rolling it down an inch. The man outside was wearing a black coat and a cruel smile. You shouldn't have gotten involved, Miss Moore, he said. His voice was soft, dangerous. Where's Ronan? I don't know, Claire whispered truthfully. The man sighed, feigning disappointment. That's unfortunate. He gestured, and another figure stepped from the shadows, this one holding a length of rope. Claire's blood turned to ice. And then, headlights. Blinding, bright headlights surged out of the darkness, barreling down the road like a raging beast. Tires screeched, and Claire ducked as the SUV next to her was struck with a sickening crunch. When she looked up, Ronan stood in the rain, panting, his knuckles bloodied. He flung open her car door. Get out, now. They drove into the night, the road endless beneath the storm. Ronan's jaw was tight, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Claire sat in silence, staring at him, her heart thudding. What's happening? She finally whispered. Ronan glanced at her, his expression raw. They think I know something worth killing for. And the key? Claire asked. His lips pressed into a thin line. It's the proof they want, proof that can destroy them. Claire's breath hitched. Ronan, who are they? The kind of people you don't cross, he said, his voice dark. For a long moment there was silence between them, broken only by the sound of the rain. I'll protect you, Claire, he said softly, glancing at her. His voice was gentler now, like he'd dropped all his defenses. I promise. Claire looked at him and realized she wasn't afraid. Not of Ronan, not of the truth, no matter how dark it was.